Science is also said to be hypothesis driven. Scientists are going to use a systematic approach to try to gain understanding of the natural world, and this normally works off of observations, the formation of a hypothesis that leads to some prediction based upon prior knowledge, an experiment, and then conclusions that are developed from this. And so if we look at sort of this quick diagram of the hierarchy of hypothesis-driven science, we see some observation made that leads to a question. Why does this work like this? How does this work like this? Etc. And this will lead to potential hypotheses. Hypotheses lead to predictions and the designing of an experiment to either accept or reject the hypotheses. And most of the time this works by formulating several hypotheses to help try and gain an understanding of the original observation. Once these predictions are confirmed, we can see theories and so forth that are developed. Now, we say that there are 5 unifying themes in biology, and we've already talked about some of these. Life is subject to chemical and physical laws. We've already mentioned that, science includes chemistry and physics as well as biology, and the laws that govern how an airplane flies also govern how a bird flies. We see that in living systems, things are built for a particular function. So structure determines function. We've already seen that living systems transform energy and matter. And by transforming energy and matter from one state to the other in the form of energy, we also liberate some heat. And we're going to be talking in the next chapter, in chapter 2, about matter and how it will be altered by living systems. Living systems depend upon tons of information, and the information transactions are stored in molecules of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. And as we'll see this semester, this molecule of DNA holds the secret to life, the central dogma, if you will. It contains a series of A's, T's, G's, and C's that is used to form the language of living things. And not only is this language of living things going to help build an individual living thing, but as it's passed from cell to cell or generation to generation of living things, it helps us to understand how evolution works to explain both the diversity of living things in our world, but also how all of these are related together. So evolution helps explain the unity and diversity of living things. And of course, we can't talk about evolution without bringing up probably the most famous scientist related to evolution, Charles Darwin. Darwin's story is a good example of how a science develops hypotheses and ultimately forms a theory, and this theory gains acceptance. The story of Darwin and the concepts of natural selection and evolution will be covered in Biology 1407, but for now we're just going to take a quick look at this. Darwin, after he graduated from college, served as a naturalist on a ship called the HMS Beagle, and this ship's main charge was to map the coastline around South America. Many years of observations and study were done before Darwin published his book titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859. And these concepts of evolution by means of natural selection help remind us of how biodiversity is reflected in the unity of life through evolution. Now, I can only imagine what Darwin's tale was like, or what his life was like, as the HMS Beagle made its voyage. But if you notice the trip of the Beagle from Europe here down to the coast of South America and around Cape Horn near Antarctica, these are some very turbulent seas, and I'm sure this was not your luxury cruise, as the HMS Beagle was only about 90 feet long and 25 feet wide with a crew of over 90. Much of Darwin's work was done at this particular stop right here along the equator on the Galapagos Islands. Now, Darwin wasn't the first person to propose the concept of evolution. And in fact, we'll see when we look at this in more detail that he wasn't even the first. But just to kind of get a quick overview, living things have changed over time. Now, an individual living thing doesn't change, but individual groups of living things change. And what Darwin contributed to this was not that living things and groups of living things evolve or go extinct. Darwin's contribution was the mechanism known as natural selection. And he developed this based upon observations, primarily in groups of finches that lived in the Galapagos that were very similar to finches native to the South American mainland. And what he noticed of the 14 different closely related species of finch on the Galapagos, they were all very well adapted to very particular types of environments, from large ground finches with very, very thick bills to consume tough seeds or nuts, to cactus finches with long tapered bills that they would use to feed on the cactus pears. Each of these totally adapted to the environment by which they live. Now we can look at the evidence for natural selection, and we see that there's sort of 5 categories of evidence that supports Darwin's theory. First is the fossil record. Transitional forms found at predicted periods of time of these fossils help us to understand how living things appeared in the past, and also gives us a window into our own past. The Earth's age. Physicists at the time of Darwin were wrong about the age of the Earth, who many thought was less than 6,000 years old. And now we know that the Earth is very old, 4.5 billion years. And this helped to support Darwin's evidence for natural selection because it shows that the Earth changes, but its change is very slow. Rapid changes can be detrimental to forms of life, because they don't have time to evolve around them. But very slow changes, obviously, life is able to adapt to. There's also a mechanism for heredity. Darwin and Mendel never knew each other, yet they were doing much of their important work at nearly the same time. Mendel, of course, and his famous pea plants helped us to understand the laws of inheritance and how important the mixing of different genetic strains from 2 different parents were to produce diversity. Comparative anatomy, using the anatomy and making comparisons between groups of organisms to help understand evolutionary origins. Looking at structures that are homologous or analogous is important. Homologous structures have the same evolutionary origin, but are different now with respect to their structure and function. While analogous structures are very different in their evolutionary origin, however, they appear to look the same and they may be used for the same purpose. For example, a butterfly and bird wings have no shared ancestry, yet they are shaped and allow for the same thing, for the organism to take flight. A good example of some homologous structures are these the homology of mammalian forelimbs as evidence for evolution. And what I want you to notice is that whether we look at a human, a cat, a bat, a porpoise, or a horse, we see the same pattern of bones here. One large bone, the humerus, close to the body, the radius and the ulna out further away, with the carpals, metacarpals, and digits. The same pattern exists in each of these limbs, yet each limb is modified to do something totally different. But these are homologous structures. And then finally, molecular evidence. And we can look at molecular evidence for evolution by comparing the genomes or even proteins of different organisms. And we use these comparisons or similarity to make things like phylogenetic trees. Phylogenetic trees are depictions kind of showing you where common ancestors might reside and looking at how organisms might be closely related to one another. For instance, here we're looking at how many different amino acid differences there are in the hemoglobin protein. Obviously, the frog and the human are very dissimilar. While the human and the bird have more in common than the human and the frog, the human and the dog certainly have more in common than the human and the bird, because the human and the dog are both mammals. When we look within the mammal group, human and rhesus monkeys have even more in common because, again, they have common ancestors that were the first primates.